The desert keeps secrets better than any human ever could. For 32 years, the Arizona sand held on to something terrible, something that haunted an entire community, something that turned neighbors into suspects and friends into strangers. But here's the thing about secrets buried in the desert. Eventually, the wind shifts, the ground cracks, and the truth claws its way back to the surface. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about a murder. It's a story about how one small town was forced to look in the mirror and realize the monster they'd been searching for had been sitting next to them at church every single Sunday. If you leave before the end of this story, you'll miss the moment when everyone in Clearwater, Arizona discovered that the person they trusted most with their children had been hiding a darkness so profound, so calculated, that investigators said it was the most chilling confession they'd ever recorded. This case changed how cold case investigations are conducted across the entire country. So before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that victims deserve to have their stories told, if you believe that justice delayed should never mean justice denied, share this video right now. Subscribe to this channel. Because cases like this one get solved when people pay attention, when communities refuse to let victims be forgotten. Your share might be the reason someone watches this who knows something about another unsolved case. That's not an exaggeration. That's how this works. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The summer of 1992 was the hottest on record in Clearwater, Arizona. I remember because I grew up there. I was 16 that summer, working at the gas station on Route 87, counting down the days until I could leave for college and never look back. Clearwater wasn't a town you dreamed about staying in. It was a town of 1,200 people, one traffic light, and the kind of quiet that could either feel peaceful or suffocating depending on which side of it you were standing on. Rachel Meadows was 17, 1 year ahead of me at Clearwater High. She had this laugh that you could hear from across any room. This way of making everyone around her feel like they were the most important person in the world. Rachel wasn't trying to leave Clearwater. She loved it there. She worked at her father's hardware store on weekends, volunteered at the elementary school reading program on Wednesdays, and had already been accepted to Arizona State where she planned to study education. She wanted to come back to Clearwater and teach. She wanted to give back to the community that had raised her. On August 14th, 1992, Rachel left her house at 7 in the morning to go for her usual run along the canyon trail. Her mother, Linda Meadows, remembers standing at the kitchen window watching her daughter stretch in the driveway. Rachel was wearing a blue tank top and white running shorts. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She waved at her mother before she started jogging toward the trail entrance, which was only 3 blocks from their house. That was the last time anyone saw Rachel Meadows alive. When Rachel didn't return by 9 that morning, Linda wasn't initially worried. Sometimes Rachel would extend her runs or stop to talk to neighbors along the way. But by noon, when Rachel still hadn't come home and wasn't answering the landline pages to their home number, Linda called her husband Marcus at the hardware store. By 2 in the afternoon, they had called the Clearwater Sheriff's Department. By 6 that evening, half the town was out searching. I was one of them. I remember walking through the brush near the canyon with my father, calling Rachel's name until my voice went hoarse. The temperature that day hit 114 degrees. Every person out there searching was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. If Rachel was hurt somewhere, if she had fallen, if she was exposed to that heat without water, time was running out. Sheriff Daniel Ortega led the search personally. He had known the Meadows family for decades. His daughter had been in Rachel's Girl Scout troop. This wasn't just a case to him. It was personal. He coordinated with state police, brought in tracking dogs, organized the volunteers into grid patterns. For 3 days, they searched every inch of that canyon, every abandoned mine shaft, every wash and ravine. On the morning of August 17th, a volunteer named Henry Dawson found Rachel's body in a dry riverbed about 4 miles from the main trail. She had been strangled. Her running shoes were missing. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on her hands and arms. The medical examiner estimated she had died within hours of her disappearance, probably before the search had even officially begun. The town of Clearwater shattered that day. I remember the sound of Linda Meadows screaming when Sheriff Ortega came to deliver the news. I was walking past their house on my way home from the search area. That sound has never left me. It comes back in dreams sometimes, even now, 32 years later. In the weeks that followed, the investigation consumed everything. The FBI sent agents to assist. State police set up a command center in the community center parking lot. Every man in Clearwater between the ages of 15 and 70 was looked at as a potential suspect. Alibis were checked and rechecked. Relationships were scrutinized. The hardware store that Marcus Meadows ran became a place people avoided, not because they blamed him, but because they didn't know what to say. How do you look at a man whose daughter was murdered and find words that mean anything at all? The investigation focused initially on transients. The Canyon Trail was sometimes used by people passing through town, homeless individuals, drifters looking for shade and solitude. But no evidence ever connected any transient to Rachel's murder. The FBI profilers suggested the killer was likely someone local, someone who knew Rachel's routine, someone who understood the terrain well enough to avoid detection during the search. That profile turned neighbor against neighbor. Suddenly, everyone was a suspect in everyone else's eyes. Friendships that had lasted generations crumbled under the weight of suspicion. Marriages fell apart when wives began questioning their husbands' whereabouts. The elementary school where Rachel had volunteered saw attendance drop because parents were afraid to let their children out of sight. I watched my town destroy itself from the inside. And the person responsible for all of it, the person who had taken Rachel's life and let an entire community tear itself apart with suspicion and fear, that person watched too. They sat in church pews and attended town meetings about the case. They shook hands with Marcus Meadows and offered condolences to Linda. They played the role of concerned citizen so perfectly that no one ever suspected a thing. For 32 years, that monster hid in plain sight. And I'm about to tell you exactly how they were finally caught. The first year after Rachel's murder was the hardest, not just for the Meadows family, but for everyone who had to keep living in a town that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that might never come. Sheriff Ortega worked the case obsessively. His office became a shrine to Rachel. Her photograph on his desk, timeline charts covering every wall, boxes of evidence stacked in corners. He interviewed over 300 people in those first 12 months. He followed every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The investigation had several promising moments that ultimately led nowhere. A gas station attendant in the next town over reported seeing a man with scratches on his face the day after Rachel's murder. That man turned out to be a ranch hand who had gotten into a fight with his brother over a gambling debt. His alibi was solid. A truck driver claimed he had picked up a hitchhiker near Clearwater who had been acting strangely, nervously asking about police activity in the area. That hitchhiker was eventually identified as a college student who had been cheating on his girlfriend and was paranoid about getting caught. Nothing connected him to Rachel. There was one suspect who occupied more of the investigation's resources than any other. His name was Dean Whitfield, and he was a 34-year-old drifter who had been camping in the canyon area in the weeks before Rachel's death. Multiple witnesses placed him near the trailhead on the morning she disappeared. He had a criminal record that included assault and burglary charges in California. When sheriff's deputies tried to question him, he fled, leading them on a chase through the desert that ended when his truck broke down near the Nevada border. Under interrogation, Dean Whitfield maintained his innocence adamantly. Yes, he had been in the canyon that morning. Yes, he had seen Rachel running on the trail. But he swore he had never spoken to her, never approached her, never touched her. He said he had run from police because he had outstanding warrants in California and didn't want to go back to prison. The physical evidence neither confirmed nor eliminated him as a suspect. There was no DNA match. The technology at the time was limited, and the samples collected from Rachel's body were degraded by the heat. Fibers found on her clothing couldn't be definitively matched to anything Whitfield owned. Without enough evidence to charge him, prosecutors had to let him go. Dean Whitfield left Arizona and was never seen in the area again. For many in Clearwater, he remained the primary suspect, the monster who had gotten away with murder because the system had failed. Linda Meadows was among those who believed Whitfield was responsible. She dedicated years of her life to tracking his movements, calling police departments in whatever town he surfaced in, warning them that a murderer was living among them. But Sheriff Ortega wasn't convinced. Something about the case didn't fit the profile of a crime committed by a transient. The killer had known exactly where to take Rachel's body, had known exactly how to avoid the search parties, had demonstrated intimate knowledge of the canyon's geography. A drifter who had been in the area for only a few weeks couldn't have possessed that knowledge. Ortega believed the killer was local, someone who had grown up exploring those canyons, someone who knew every hiding place, every blind spot, every location where a body might go undiscovered for days. But belief wasn't evidence. And as the months turned into years, the case went cold. The FBI agents returned to Phoenix. The State Police Command Center was dismantled. The boxes of evidence were moved to a storage facility. Sheriff Ortega retired in 1998, the Rachel Meadows case being the only major investigation of his career that he failed to close. It haunted him until the day he died in 2015. Marcus and Linda Meadows never recovered. Their marriage, which had been strong for 20 years before Rachel's death, couldn't survive the weight of grief and the poison of unanswered questions. They divorced in 1997. Marcus sold the hardware store and moved to Tucson, where he lived alone until his death from a heart attack in 2008. Linda stayed in Clearwater, in the same house where she had watched her daughter stretch in the driveway that August morning. She became a recluse, rarely leaving except to visit Rachel's grave or to attend the annual vigil the town held on the anniversary of her death. I left Clearwater for college in 1994 and swore I would never go back. The town felt poisoned to me, corrupted by what had happened and by what it had revealed about the fragility of trust. I built a life in Phoenix, became a journalist, got married, had children. But Clearwater never really left me. The Rachel Meadows case stayed in the back of my mind like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. Every few years, I would search for updates online, hoping someone had finally solved it. Every few years, I found nothing. Then, in 2019, everything changed. The state of Arizona had begun a cold case initiative, using advances in DNA technology to re-examine evidence from unsolved crimes. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that had caught the Golden State Killer the year before, was being applied to cases across the country. The Rachel Meadows case was selected as one of the first in Arizona to undergo this new analysis. The original evidence had been carefully preserved. Despite the heat damage and the primitive collection methods of the early 90s, technicians were able to extract a usable DNA profile from material found under Rachel's fingernails. She had fought her attacker. She had scratched them. And in doing so, she had captured the evidence that would eventually lead to justice. The DNA profile was uploaded to genetic genealogy databases. The search began for distant relatives who might have submitted their DNA for ancestry testing, people who shared enough genetic markers to point investigators toward a family tree that included the killer. It was painstaking work, involving hundreds of hours of research, the construction of family trees going back generations, the systematic elimination of potential suspects. In March of 2023, investigators identified a family in Arizona that matched the DNA profile. The family had been in the Clearwater area for over a century. Several members still lived there. One of them was a man who had been in his late 20s in 1992, who had known Rachel Meadows personally, who had been interviewed during the original investigation and cleared based on an alibi that was now being re-examined. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and when I learned his name, I felt something inside me collapse. Because Thomas Whitmore wasn't some stranger on the margins of the community. Thomas Whitmore was the youth pastor at Clearwater Baptist Church. He was the man who had organized the first search party. He was the man who had delivered meals to the Meadows family in the weeks after Rachel's death. He was the man who had spoken at her funeral, offering words of comfort and faith while her parents wept. Thomas Whitmore had been hiding in plain sight for 32 years, and the community that had trusted him with their children, that had looked to him for spiritual guidance in their darkest moments, had no idea who he really was. I need to tell you about Thomas Whitmore about who he was and who he pretended to be, because understanding that gap is essential to understanding how something like this could happen. How a monster could walk among decent people for 3 decades without anyone suspecting the truth. Thomas Whitmore came to Clearwater in 1987, 5 years before Rachel's murder. He was 23 years old, fresh out of a Bible college in Oklahoma, full of energy and enthusiasm and what everyone interpreted as genuine faith. The Baptist church in Clearwater had been struggling with attendance, particularly among young people. The previous pastor had been elderly, beloved but out of touch with the changing needs of a new generation. Thomas was hired specifically to build a youth ministry, to bring teenagers back to the church, to create programs that would engage them spiritually. By all accounts, he was extraordinarily successful. Within 2 years, the youth group had grown from a dozen members to over 50. Thomas organized camping trips, mission projects, Bible study groups, and after-school programs. He was charismatic, funny, relatable. Kids loved him. Parents trusted him. He became such a fixture in the community that people sometimes forgot he hadn't been born there. Rachel Meadows was one of the most active members of his youth group. She helped organize events, mentored younger students, and served on the church's volunteer council. Thomas and Rachel worked closely together on numerous projects. When Rachel was killed, Thomas wept openly at her funeral. He led grief counseling sessions for the teenagers who had lost their friend. He visited Linda and Marcus Meadows every week for months, praying with them, helping with household tasks, being a constant presence of support. The investigation in 1992 had briefly looked at Thomas, as it had looked at every male in the community. His alibi was that he had been at the church that morning, preparing for a meeting that was scheduled for later in the day. The church secretary, a woman named Doris Chun, confirmed that she had seen him there around 8 in the morning. Based on the timeline of Rachel's disappearance, that should have eliminated him as a suspect. What investigators didn't know in 1992, and what wouldn't be discovered until 2023, was that Doris Chun had actually arrived at the church at 9:15 that morning, not 8. She had misremembered the time in the chaos and emotion of the investigation. Thomas had asked her to confirm his alibi, and she had done so in good faith, genuinely believing she had seen him at the time she stated. She had been deceived, and in turn, she had unknowingly deceived the investigators. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the genealogy pointed to Thomas's family tree, investigators began building a case. They needed a sample of his DNA to confirm the match. Getting that sample without alerting him required careful planning. Investigators surveilled Thomas for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to collect discarded material, a coffee cup, a tissue, a cigarette butt. Thomas was careful, though. It was almost as if he sensed he was being watched. Finally, in September 2023, Thomas attended a community barbecue where he used a plastic fork and napkin. After he discarded them in a trash can, investigators collected the items. The DNA was tested against the profile from Rachel's fingernails. It was a match. Not partial. Not probable. Perfect. The next step was perhaps the most difficult. Investigators had to build a case that could survive in court 32 years after the crime. DNA evidence alone, while powerful, needed to be supported by other factors. They re-interviewed everyone they could find who had been connected to the original investigation. They re-examined Thomas's history before he came to Clearwater. They looked for patterns. What they found was chilling. Before Thomas Whitmore came to Clearwater, he had worked at a church in a small town in New Mexico. He left that position abruptly in 1986. A 17-year-old girl from that church had accused him of inappropriate behavior. Not assault, but persistent, unwanted attention, comments that made her uncomfortable, invitations to meet him alone that she always refused. The church had quietly asked Thomas to resign rather than face a formal investigation. No charges were ever filed. No records were kept that followed him to his next position. In Oklahoma, where Thomas attended Bible college, there were rumors that a female student had complained about him to the administration. The specifics were never documented. Thomas graduated without incident and was recommended for pastoral positions without any mention of concerns. The pattern was clear. Thomas Whitmore had been targeting young women for years, testing boundaries, looking for opportunities. Rachel Meadows had been his victim because she was everything he was drawn to: young, trusting, connected to his world through the church. What made Rachel different from the others? What made her the victim of murder rather than inappropriate behavior? Investigators never fully determined. Perhaps she had rejected in advance. Perhaps she had threatened to report him. Perhaps the isolation of the canyon trail had simply presented an opportunity that previous situations hadn't. I think often about what this means, about how systems designed to protect people can fail so catastrophically. Here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about this. I want you to leave a comment and tell me what you think. In a world where information about misconduct can so easily be buried or ignored, how do we protect the vulnerable? How do we ensure that warning signs are never dismissed as inconvenient or too complicated to address? What would you do if you discovered someone you trusted had been hiding a dangerous secret? Leave your answer below, because this conversation matters. It matters for every community trying to protect its members from the predators hiding in their midst. The arrest of Thomas Whitmore was planned for October 3, 2023. Investigators decided to take him at his home in the early morning, before he could leave for the church where he still worked, 3 decades after Rachel's death. For sheriff's deputies approached the modest ranch house where Thomas lived alone, his wife having died of cancer in 2011 and his children grown and living in other states. When they knocked on the door at 6 in the morning, Thomas answered in his bathrobe. According to the deputies present, his expression remained calm when they told him he was under arrest for the murder of Rachel Meadows. He didn't resist. He didn't protest. He simply asked if he could get dressed first. While a deputy accompanied him to his bedroom, Thomas moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had been expecting this moment, preparing for it, for a very long time. He was transported to the county jail in Phoenix, where he was booked on first-degree murder charges. His bail was denied. His public defender began preparing for what everyone expected would be a lengthy legal battle. Thomas had resources, the church had paid him well, and he had been careful with money over the years. He could afford a robust defense. The arrest of Thomas Whitmore didn't just shock Clearwater. It detonated in the community like a bomb, leaving everyone to sift through the wreckage of everything they thought they knew. I drove back to Clearwater the day after the arrest was announced. It was the first time I had been back in 15 years. The town looked smaller than I remembered, more faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I went to the coffee shop on Main Street, the same one that had been there when I was a teenager, though it had changed owners 3 times since then. People were gathered in small groups, talking in low voices, their expressions shell-shocked. I recognized some of them, older now, gray-haired, weathered by decades of desert living. They didn't recognize me, which was fine. I wasn't there to reunite with anyone. I was there to witness what happens to a community when its foundations crack. The stories came pouring out over the following days. People who had known Thomas, who had trusted him, who had sent their children to his youth group, were struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster the DNA evidence revealed. Many refused to believe it. Thomas had supporters who insisted he was being framed, that the DNA evidence had been contaminated or fabricated, that there was no way the kind, gentle pastor they had known for 30 years could have done something so terrible. But others remembered things they had dismissed at the time, things they had rationalized away, things that now took on a sinister new meaning. A woman named Carol Henderson told me that Thomas had once driven Rachel home from a youth group meeting when Rachel's car wouldn't start. Carol had thought nothing of it at the time. Now she wondered what had happened during that drive, what conversations might have taken place, what seeds might have been planted. A man named Frank Ortiz, Sheriff Ortega's nephew, remembered that Thomas had been particularly insistent about joining the initial search for Rachel. He had positioned himself as a leader among the volunteers, organizing groups, directing efforts, offering encouragement. Frank had admired his dedication at the time. Now he recognized it for what it was: a killer inserting himself into the investigation, monitoring its progress, steering it away from any direction that might lead to him. Most disturbing were the accounts from women who had been teenagers in Thomas's youth group during the years after Rachel's murder. Several came forward to describe behavior that they had found uncomfortable but had never reported. Thomas standing too close. Thomas making comments about their appearance that felt inappropriate. Thomas suggesting one-on-one meetings to discuss their spiritual development. None of them had been assaulted, but all of them had sensed something wrong, something predatory, something they couldn't quite articulate as young girls navigating a world that told them to trust their elders, especially those who spoke with the authority of God. One woman, who asked me not to use her name, broke down crying as she described an incident in 1997. She had been 16, going through a difficult time at home. Thomas had offered to counsel her. They met in his office at the church, door closed. He put his hand on her knee and asked her if she ever felt lonely, if she ever wanted someone to hold her. She had frozen, unsure what to do. Before anything else happened, another church member knocked on the door, interrupting them. Thomas had immediately removed his hand and acted as if nothing had occurred. The woman never told anyone. She blamed herself for decades, wondering if she had somehow invited the attention, if she had misinterpreted an innocent gesture. Listening to these stories, I understood something important about how Thomas Whitmore had evaded justice for so long. It wasn't just that he was clever, though he was. It wasn't just that the investigation had made mistakes, though it had. It was that the systems designed to protect people, the church, the community, the assumption of goodness in those who hold positions of trust, had all failed. They had failed Rachel. They had failed the young women who came after her. They had created an environment where a predator could thrive unchallenged. Linda Meadows was 82 years old when Thomas Whitmore was arrested. She had spent 32 years waiting for this moment, never knowing if it would come. I went to see her at her house, the same house she had lived in since 1985, the house with the driveway where Rachel had stretched before her final run. Linda was frail but sharp. Her eyes held a fierce intelligence that age hadn't dimmed. She invited me in, made tea, sat in the living room surrounded by photographs of Rachel at every age. When I asked her how she felt about the arrest, she was quiet for a long moment. She told me that she had always known it was someone from Clearwater. She said she had looked at every man at Rachel's funeral, every man at church, every man in the grocery store, and wondered which one of them had taken her daughter. For 32 years, she had carried that suspicion like a stone in her chest. Now the stone had a name. But she wasn't experiencing relief, she said. Not yet. Relief would come when Thomas Whitmore was convicted, when he spent the rest of his life in prison, when he looked into the eyes of a jury and had to hear what he had done to Rachel described in precise, legal terms. She said relief would come when she could stand in that courtroom and know that her daughter's killer had finally been held accountable. Then she said something that I will never forget. She said that she had one more thing to do before she could find peace. She needed to look Thomas Whitmore in the face. She needed to sit in that courtroom and let him know that she had never stopped fighting for Rachel, that she had never given up, that he had spent 32 years thinking he had gotten away with murder, and she had spent 32 years making sure that wasn't true. She smiled when she said this, and for a moment, I could see the young mother she had been, the woman who had watched her daughter stretch in the driveway, full of love and hope and the reasonable expectation that her child would come home. The trial was scheduled for June 2024. Thomas Whitmore had pleaded not guilty, claiming the DNA evidence had been contaminated and that he was the victim of a witch hunt by investigators desperate to close a high-profile cold case. His defense attorney was aggressive, filing motion after motion to exclude evidence, to delay proceedings, to create doubt wherever possible. But the prosecution was prepared. They had the DNA. They had the timeline inconsistencies in Thomas's alibi. They had the pattern of behavior toward young women that demonstrated a predatory personality. They had 32 years of evidence that had been meticulously preserved and re-examined with modern techniques. And they had something else, something that would change the trial entirely and lead to one of the most dramatic moments in Arizona legal history. The weeks leading up to the trial were tense. Thomas Whitmore remained in custody, denied bail due to the severity of the charge and his demonstrated ties to a community that might help him flee. His children, a son and daughter in their 40s, had distanced themselves from him publicly, issuing a brief statement saying they were shocked and heartbroken by the allegations. Neither planned to attend the trial. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney Maria Gonzalez, a veteran prosecutor who had been a junior attorney in the office when the original investigation had occurred. She remembered the case, remembered the frustration of having a suspect they couldn't charge, remembered the way the unsolved murder had hung over the county for decades. For her, this was personal. Gonzalez had built a case that was methodical and devastating. The DNA evidence was the foundation, but she layered it with circumstantial evidence that painted a picture of Thomas Whitmore as a calculated predator. She subpoenaed records from his previous churches, uncovering the complaints that had been buried and ignored. She found witnesses who could testify to his behavior toward young women, including several who had been teenagers in his youth group. She reconstructed the timeline of August 14, 1992, showing that Thomas had ample time to intercept Rachel on the canyon trail and return to the church before anyone noticed his absence. But the defense wasn't going quietly. Thomas's attorney, a high-profile criminal defense lawyer named Richard Castellano, attacked every element of the prosecution's case. He brought in DNA experts who raised questions about the chain of custody of the original evidence. He argued that the genetic genealogy technique was unreliable and had led to false identifications in other cases. He painted the witnesses as opportunists seeking attention or people whose memories had been corrupted by the passage of time. The trial began on June 3, 2024. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country had descended on the small courthouse. Linda Meadows sat in the front row, flanked by supporters from a victims' advocacy organization. She never took her eyes off Thomas Whitmore. Thomas sat at the defense table looking nothing like the monster the prosecution described. He was 70 years old now, white-haired, soft-spoken, wearing a modest gray suit. He looked like what he had pretended to be for 30 years, a kind, gentle pastor who had devoted his life to serving others. It was deeply unsettling to see him there, projecting an image of innocence while the evidence against him was so damning. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case in clear, compelling terms. Gonzalez described Rachel's last morning, her run on the canyon trail, her encounter with a killer who knew her and knew the terrain. She described how Thomas had positioned himself at the center of the community's grief, how he had comforted Rachel's parents while carrying the secret of what he had done. She told the jury that the DNA under Rachel's fingernails was proof not just of Thomas's presence, but of Rachel's fight, her final, desperate attempt to mark her killer so that someday, somehow, he would be found. The defense countered with a narrative of reasonable doubt. Castellano acknowledged that his client had known Rachel, that they had worked together in the church, that there might be innocent explanations for DNA transfer. He suggested that the evidence had been contaminated, that investigators were so eager to close the case that they had overlooked alternative suspects. He reminded the jury that Thomas Whitmore had no criminal record, had never been accused of violence, had lived an exemplary life in service to his faith and community. The first week of testimony was dominated by forensic experts debating the DNA evidence. The prosecution's witnesses explained the genetic genealogy process in detail, describing how the match had been made and confirmed. The defense's experts raised technical objections, questioning the collection methods used in 1992, suggesting that the samples might have been compromised. Then, in the second week, something happened that no one expected. A man named David Whitmore, Thomas's nephew, contacted the prosecution. He had information he needed to share. Information that would change everything. David was 52 years old, a construction manager living in Flagstaff. He had been 20 in 1992, living with his parents in Clearwater. He had looked up to his uncle Thomas, admired him, wanted to be like him. When Thomas was arrested, David had initially assumed it was a mistake, that his uncle was innocent. But the arrest had triggered memories. Memories David had buried for decades. Memories he had convinced himself were dreams or misunderstandings. Now those memories were demanding to be heard. David told prosecutors that in August 1992, about a week after Rachel's murder, He had stopped by his uncle's house unexpectedly. He had walked in through the back door, which was unlocked, calling out for Thomas. He found his uncle in the garage, standing over a metal barrel, burning something. David asked what he was doing. Thomas spun around, his face twisted with anger, an expression David had never seen before. Thomas ordered him out, told him never to come in without knocking again, told him to forget what he had seen. David left, confused and frightened. He never mentioned it to anyone. He told himself it was nothing, that his uncle was burning trash or old documents, that there was an innocent explanation. He buried the memory so deep that he almost forgot it had happened. Until now. Until he saw his uncle's face on the news, heard the charges against him, and felt that memory rise up like something long submerged finally breaking the surface. David agreed to testify. David Whitmore took the stand on the afternoon of June 17, 2024. The courtroom was absolutely silent as he described what he had witnessed 32 years earlier. His voice was steady but his hands shook. He couldn't look at his uncle, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. David described the burning barrel, the way Thomas had reacted, the fear he had seen in his uncle's eyes. He testified that he had never forgotten that moment, even though he had tried to convince himself it meant nothing. He said that when he heard about the arrest, he finally understood what he had seen. He believed his uncle had been burning evidence, possibly the running shoes that were never recovered from Rachel's body. The defense attacked David's testimony aggressively. Castellano suggested that David was fabricating the memory, either for attention or because he had been influenced by the media coverage. He pointed out that David had never mentioned this incident before, not to police, not to family, not to anyone for 32 years. He asked why anyone should believe a memory that had been buried so long. David's answer was simple. He said he didn't believe it himself. Not really. Not until he was forced to. He said he had loved his uncle. He said admitting what he had seen meant admitting that his family included a murderer, that his childhood had been shaped by a lie. He said he had spent 32 years protecting himself from that truth. But Rachel Meadows deserved the truth more than he deserved protection. The jury was visibly moved. Several members wiped their eyes. Linda Meadows sat motionless, her gaze fixed on David with something like gratitude. But the most devastating moment of the trial was yet to come. On June 20th, the prosecution called Thomas Whitmore to testify in his own defense. It was a risky move by Castellano. Putting a defendant on the stand always opens them up to cross-examination. But Castellano believed that Thomas's apparent sincerity, his decades of pastoral service, might sway the jury in ways that evidence alone could not. Thomas took the stand and performed beautifully. He spoke softly about his faith, his devotion to the community, his love for the young people he had mentored. He denied any involvement in Rachel's murder. He expressed sympathy for the Meadows family and understanding for why they might want someone to blame. He was calm, measured, and utterly convincing. Then Maria Gonzalez began her cross-examination. She started with simple questions about the morning of August 14, 1992. Where was Thomas? What was he doing? Thomas repeated his alibi, that he had been at the church all morning, preparing for a meeting. Gonzalez asked about Doris Chun, the church secretary who had confirmed his presence. Thomas said yes, Doris had seen him. Gonzalez then produced a document. It was a calendar from August 1992, found in the church's archived records. It showed that the meeting Thomas claimed to be preparing for was not scheduled until the following week. There had been no meeting on August 14th. No preparation had been necessary. Thomas hesitated. His composure flickered. He said he must have been preparing for something else, perhaps a youth group event, perhaps personal study. The calendar must be incomplete. Gonzalez pressed harder. She asked about the burning barrel David had described. Thomas denied it ever happened. She asked about the complaints from his previous churches, the young women who had felt uncomfortable around him. Thomas said those complaints were misunderstandings, that he had done nothing wrong, that he was the victim of false accusations. Then Gonzalez asked the question that broke him. She asked Thomas if he had ever touched Rachel Meadows inappropriately. She asked if Rachel had ever threatened to expose him, to tell someone what he had done, to end the life he had built on deception. Thomas's face changed. The mask slipped. For just a moment, something dark and cold flickered in his eyes, something that had been hidden for decades, something that the jury saw clearly. He said nothing. He sat in the witness box, breathing hard, staring at Gonzalez with an expression that contradicted every word of denial he had spoken. Then he requested to speak with his attorney. The judge called a recess. When court resumed 20 minutes later, Richard Castellano approached the bench. His face was pale. He informed the judge that his client wished to change his plea. Thomas Whitmore was pleading guilty to the murder of Rachel Meadows. The courtroom erupted. Media members rushed for the exits to file breaking news reports. Spectators gasped and cried. Linda Meadows sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Thomas stood before the judge and formally entered his guilty plea. When asked if he understood the consequences, he nodded. When asked if he was entering the plea voluntarily, he said yes. When asked to allocute, to describe what he had done, he spoke for the first time without the mask. He said he had encountered Rachel on the canyon trail that morning. He said they had talked. He said things had gotten out of control. He said he hadn't meant for it to happen, that he hadn't planned it, that something inside him had snapped. He didn't apologize. He didn't look at Linda Meadows. He spoke as if he was describing something that had happened to someone else, something distant and abstract, something that didn't quite involve him. When he finished, the judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for July. The sentencing hearing took place on July 15, 2024. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, crowded into the doorways, spilled into the hallway. Media cameras recorded everything for a worldwide audience. Linda Meadows had prepared a victim impact statement. She had worked on it for weeks, refining every word, making sure she said exactly what she needed to say. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the podium at the front of the courtroom. She was 82 years old, using a cane, but her voice was clear and strong. She spoke directly to Thomas Whitmore, who was required to look at her as she read her statement. She told him about Rachel. She described her daughter's first words, her first steps, her first day of school. She described Rachel's kindness, her laughter, her dreams of becoming a teacher. She described the morning of August 14, 1992, watching Rachel stretch in the driveway, waving goodbye, never knowing it was the last time. She described the years that followed, the destroyed marriage, the crippling depression, the endless questions without answers, the way she had looked at every man in Clearwater and wondered which one of them had killed her child. She described the moment she learned it was Thomas, the man who had prayed with her, the man who had brought her casseroles and comfort, the man who had spoken at Rachel's funeral about God's mysterious plan. She said she had vomited when she heard his name. She said she had screamed until her throat bled. Then she told Thomas Whitmore something that silenced the entire courtroom. She said she had decided to forgive him. Not for his sake, she made that clear. She said he deserved nothing from her, no forgiveness, no mercy, no grace. She said she was forgiving him for herself, because carrying hatred for 32 years had almost destroyed her. She said Rachel would want her to let go, to find peace, to live whatever time she had left without the poison of rage. She said she forgave Thomas Whitmore, but she would never forget. She said she would remember Rachel every day until she died. She said she would remember what he had done. She said she would remember that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Then she turned to the judge and asked for the maximum sentence. She said Thomas Whitmore had stolen 32 years of freedom by evading justice. She said he should spend whatever years he had left in a cell, alone with the knowledge of what he had done. Other speakers followed. Women who had been teenagers in Thomas's youth group described the fear they had felt, the boundaries he had crossed, the way his behavior had affected their ability to trust. Community members described the damage his crime and subsequent deception had caused to Clearwater, the suspicion, the broken relationships, the shadow that had hung over the town for decades. Thomas Whitmore was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood before the court looking smaller than he had during the trial, diminished by the weight of his exposure. He said he was sorry. He said he had carried guilt for 32 years. He said he had tried to make amends through his work with young people, though he seemed to realize even as he said it how obscene that sounded. The judge interrupted him. She said his attempts at amends were themselves a form of continued abuse, inserting himself into the lives of vulnerable young people while carrying the secret of what he had done to Rachel. She said his work with the church was not redemption. It was continuation. It was the behavior of a predator hiding in plain sight. Then she pronounced the sentence. Thomas Whitmore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given his age, this meant he would die behind bars. The judge said this was the only appropriate outcome for a crime of such magnitude, committed by someone who had exploited his position of trust, evaded justice for 3 decades, and shown no genuine remorse. Thomas was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look back. Linda Meadows watched him go, her face wet with tears but her spine straight. When the courtroom doors closed behind him, she allowed herself to collapse into the arms of the people who had supported her through everything. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. They cheered when the sentence was announced. Some held photographs of Rachel. Others held signs demanding justice for other cold case victims. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a community finally released from a burden it had carried for far too long. I stood in that crowd, watching everything, feeling the weight of my own history with this case, this town, this tragedy. I had been 16 when Rachel was killed. I was 48 now. The years between had taken me far from Clearwater, but they had never truly separated me from what happened here. Now, finally, there was something like closure. Not healing. That would take longer, if it was even possible. But closure. An ending. A period at the end of a sentence that had run on for 3 decades. The aftermath of Thomas Whitmore's conviction rippled far beyond Clearwater. The case became a landmark in cold case investigation, cited in training materials for law enforcement across the country. The use of genetic genealogy to solve the murder demonstrated the power of modern forensic techniques to bring justice to cases that had seemed permanently closed. But more importantly, the case sparked a national conversation about the systems that had allowed Thomas Whitmore to evade detection for so long. Churches and community organizations began implementing stricter background check procedures. States passed laws requiring better documentation of complaints against individuals in positions of trust. The pattern of covering up misconduct to avoid scandal was exposed and condemned. Linda Meadows did not live to see the first anniversary of Thomas's conviction. She died peacefully in her sleep in September 2024, surrounded by family and friends who had supported her through the long journey to justice. Those who knew her said she had found peace in her final months, that the resolution of Rachel's case had allowed her to let go of the anger that had sustained her for so long. She was buried next to Rachel in the Clearwater Cemetery. Her headstone reads, "Beloved Mother, tireless advocate, forever remembered." The annual vigil for Rachel continued, now honoring both mother and daughter. Thomas Whitmore died in prison in February 2025, less than a year into his sentence. The official cause was heart failure, though some speculated that the collapse of his decades-long deception had simply broken something inside him. He had no funeral service. His children did not claim his body. He was buried in the prison cemetery, his grave marked only with a number. I returned to Clearwater for the final time in March 2025 to attend a memorial service for Linda Meadows and to pay my respects at Rachel's grave. The town was different than I remembered, smaller, quieter, more fragile. But there was also something lighter about it, as if a shadow that had hung over everything had finally lifted. I stood at Rachel's grave for a long time, thinking about who she had been and who she might have become. She would have been 49 now, probably a teacher, probably married, probably a mother herself. She would have watched her students grow up and leave Clearwater and return to start families of their own. She would have been part of the fabric of this community, not a wound in it. But that life was stolen from her by a man who wore kindness as a disguise. And while nothing could give that life back, justice had finally been served. Her killer had died in prison, exposed and alone. Her mother had lived to see accountability. Her story had inspired changes that might protect others from suffering the same fate. Standing there, I thought about what this case had taught me. It taught me that evil can hide behind the most benevolent masks. It taught me that trust must be earned, not assumed, and that positions of authority should demand greater scrutiny, not less. It taught me that the past is never truly past, that secrets buried in the desert will eventually find their way to the surface, that justice delayed is painful, but not impossible. Most of all, it taught me that the people we lose deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as the full human beings they were before their lives were cut short. Rachel Meadows was not just a cold case number. She was a daughter who loved her parents. She was a friend who made people laugh. She was a young woman who wanted to teach children to read, who believed she could make her community better, who had so much life ahead of her. That life was stolen, but her memory endures. And in that memory, there is something like victory, not complete, never complete, but real. A declaration that Rachel Meadows mattered, that her death would not go unanswered, that even 32 years later, justice would find a way. The desert keeps secrets, but it also reveals them, eventually, to those patient and determined enough to keep searching. This is not just a story about a murder. It is a story about a community that was forced to confront its own blind spots, about a family that never stopped fighting, about a system that failed and then, finally, corrected itself. It is a story about the price of trust betrayed and the power of truth to prevail. Rachel Meadows deserved better than she got, but she also got something that many victims never receive: justice. And in the end, that is what matters most. Not vengeance, not closure, justice. For Rachel, for Linda, for everyone who ever believed that the truth would eventually come to light. It did.